Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Community Connection. I am one of your hosts, Vicki Olorcia-Casella, licensed professional counselor, along with my co-host, Mark. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Vicki, and yourself.
I'm doing all right. I'm excited to be here. And
Yes, me
our special guest,
too.
Jason Boyko, I said that correctly, right? Clinical
Yeah.
supervisor from Lehigh Valley Hospital. We're going to be discussing the topic is addressing grief and loss during COVID-19. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Before we dive into questions, would you like to explain a little bit further about what your title or role is at the hospital?
Sure. So basically, I'm the clinical supervisor for an outpatient psychiatric practice, the largest practice that Lehigh Valley has. And so I spend some time providing therapy to patients, but I spend most of my time just providing supervision for the other therapists and psychologists, and I oversee a large team of nurses and caseworkers and medical assistants, and kind of help navigate, the day-to-day for our patients. And in addition to that, I also teach some classes for the Chestnut Hill graduate program.
Oh, that's
So,
wonderful.
yeah.
Oh, and Vicki, can I just add that again, it's an honor to be on a program with two of our alumni from the master's program from Chestnut Hill College at DeSales University. So it's quite an honor to have and participate in this conversation today.
I feel like this is going to be happening more often. This is now the second time, right? It's very nice. It's a nice feeling to see us all connecting again.
Yes.
But thank you for
Exactly.
bringing that up.
Sure.
And I do want to mention my disclaimer really quick before we get into the questions, that if anyone who is watching or listening is currently experiencing any severe symptoms of any kind, to please reach out to your therapist, doctor, caseworker, crisis worker, hospital, whoever's in your support system. Reach out to us as well if you'd like to, but just make sure that you're reaching out to someone for help, because it's needed. I think we all need help at some point in our lives. So let's dive in. Question number one, Jason, can you explain the difference between grief, mourning, and bereavement?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. What happens is most of us use those words interchangeably, because it kind of speaks to a lot of the same things, but they're actually very different things. And it's important, I think, for those dealing with grief to have that distinction, because it helps us to understand the process. So essentially, grief is your own personal reaction to a loss, right? And so, whatever that loss is, it's how you respond to it. So with that, there's no right or wrong, because it's how you are experiencing it. Mourning is really the process of grieving. So mourning is what we need to do in order to reconcile our grief. And usually mourning is a very public thing as well. It's how we display our grief to others, and oftentimes requires participation of other people in our life to help us express and experience our grief. Whereas bereavement, people who feel bereft often feel like, they something's been torn away from them, or they've been, robbed or cheated in some way. So that's how it got kind of put into that grief category, because so many people dealing with loss or life changes feel that way. But in and of itself, it's simply a describing word.
Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into that. And what has been your understanding of the things that people could be possibly grieving during this pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think a lot of times, again, when we hear those words like grief and mourning and bereavement, we assume death right away, because it's kind of the big one, the ultimate one. But there are so many things that we can grieve for. I mean, essentially, because we're human, we form attachments, right? I mean, if we look at like the work of John Bowlby and with attachment theory, that the whole loss experience exists because of those attachments we form. So if I form a great bond with my place of employment, and then my job is terminated, which can happen to a lot of people, now I'm grieving for the loss of that job, right? And that job also has a lot of other things associated with it, right? So perhaps my finances then are being impacted, which could impact my socioeconomic status. It could impact the groups of people I hang out with or the activities that I do. Perhaps I really enjoy, I don't know, some type of sport or something that requires money that I don't have now. So there's all types of what we would call secondary losses that go along with it. So, you know, also perhaps maybe my job is a great sense of pride and accomplishment for me. And because of that, now I'm doubting, you know, my self-worth and all those types of things. And two, I think, you know, the things in the pandemic would be like, you know, missing out on relationships, and seeing those people that are part of our life that maybe we're not connecting with, missing out on opportunities, you know, things that may have arisen had we been able to go and connect with so-and-so. And, you know, the importance of ritual and ceremony is huge when it comes to transitional periods in our life. So when we look at grief, we have ritual and ceremony with things like, you know, funerals, memorial services, etc. But looking just at our culture in general, we have all types of rituals and ceremonies. We have graduations, we have weddings, we have funerals, and the pandemic kind of puts all of those things on hold or cancels them altogether. You know, I know I have several clients that I've been working with who don't have their college graduations or their high school graduations, or they're different than the way they were planning on having those things. And you know, I even had one person who graduated college but wasn't able to move out and got a job in another state and is now moving but still has stuff at a college in this state, so it's kind of going back and forth between 3 homes. Wow. And so those types of things, not being able to say goodbye, whether it's to a person or a place, and I think, you know, honestly, probably one of the biggest things that goes untalked about is our sense of safety and security. You know, when we experience something that's, you know, it affects us all in such a way that we're not really used to, our safety and security gets challenged. The way we view the world, and, you know, our experience of it. And that has an impact that isn't always so forthright. People don't always necessarily see that one as it happens, but they have this kind of underlying kind of differences now. They see the world a little bit differently. So I know that was a lot. Hopefully.
Well, no, thank you for sharing, because I think sometimes and many times people don't consider those other events in their life as losses, although we're, you know, hearing people express them, but maybe not really understanding the context. So thank you for really
Sure.
putting that into a context into this concept that we're talking about.
And I think that list that you gave, I don't know one person who hasn't been affected from one of those things that you named on that list. So it just kind of bringing us all together that we're all experiencing some level of grief or loss during this pandemic, whether I think we're defining it as that or not. At least that's how I've been defining it to some of my clients. And once I connect how we're feeling to those words, they're kind of having this aha moment of like, oh, you're right. That is how I'm kind of feeling. So how would you describe anticipatory grief?
So anticipatory grief is really grief that occurs as soon as we know that a loss is coming, right? So we haven't yet experienced it. We may have experienced parts of it or none of it at all yet. And so we're kind of looking ahead and thinking about what it's going to be like when this loss or this change occurs. And, what we know about anxiety is it's all about forward thinking, right? So unfortunately, anticipatory grief is a great breeding ground for anxiety. So oftentimes people will experience a very intense anticipatory grief, which can be more challenging than the grief itself after the loss or the transition has occurred. Because it's hard to deal with something that we don't really know how it's going to be. So you'll see people, in the most obvious form, when people become hospitalized with COVID-19, you see their family members and them, kind of anticipating what's going to happen, and worrying about, will the person die? And for the person who's sick, worrying about, am I going to lose my life? Which we would call more of a preparatory grief. But unfortunately, when you're that sick, where you're just kind of in the hospital on a ventilator, laying in a prone position, you don't have a lot of opportunity for preparatory grief either. So those things that somebody with a terminal illness might be able to kind of work on, like, getting their affairs in order and saying goodbyes and all of those types of things. When you're that acutely ill and you don't know the outcome for sure, you don't really get to prepare in any way. And that anticipation just builds and builds and builds for everybody involved. And it, depending on how you deal with anxiety or any co-occurring stressors or other losses in your life. So what we've seen is, unfortunately, people with multiple losses in different areas where they have maybe one of them has lost their job, and now someone gets sick, is in the hospital, so now they're facing the loss of that person as well. And now you kind of have these compounding losses due to all of this, which we know puts people at a greater risk for, depression or severe anxiety or other forms of mental health disturbance that, if not treated properly, can lead to some pretty bad long-term outcomes for people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
I like the word you also put, loss and change. I like in that response.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah.
A nice addition to that. What is disenfranchised grief, and how does it relate to societal events?
So disenfranchised grief essentially is saying that the person who's grieving the loss or the change is kind of being disempowered to do so. They don't really have a strong voice with it, and usually it's because there's some type of shame or misunderstanding on the larger society's part about why that loss or that change actually matters. So Ken Doka, actually, DOKA, came up with that term, and he has a book about it. It's really fascinating. But, in some pretty obvious ways, we can see things like someone who loses a child to drug addiction, and then they don't want to talk about it because there's this sense of shame that goes along with drug addiction. And you can even take that a step further, let's say, and I've had clients who've gone to like a support group for people who lose children, like Compassionate Friends, and feeling ostracized because their child died due to like a drug overdose, whereas someone else's child died to a disease or a car accident. So now they're feeling disempowered, disenfranchised, because people aren't necessarily looking at them the same as others. So I guess if we look at that through the eyes of a pandemic, many people won't necessarily understand, what the big deal is about, my small club closing, my men's card game that happens every Wednesday night or something. Like, not having that and being upset about that, people will say things like, well, get over it, or what's the big deal, you'll get to do it again one day. And those types of comments are not helpful. They're really not helpful. In fact, they hurt a lot of people. And when we look at the things that we were kind of discussing earlier about different types of losses, if I'm not able to go to my high school graduation, and you're like, yeah, well, you'll have a college one. That's very well-meaning, but it's not helpful to the person that's going through it. It's kind of like, let's not be sad. Let's get you past what you're feeling and move you away from your grief, move you toward this place of being better, because we don't like being sad, and we don't like people around us being sad, and we want to fix everything. And so a lot of what we have to do, instead of disenfranchising people, is empowering them and actually moving people toward their grief or toward their loss. So, you're upset about not being able to graduate. Why? Let's talk about that. What does that mean to you? Why is this such a big deal? Instead of, well, it's okay, you'll have a college graduation perhaps.
Right.
And so there's a lot of well-meaning things, like thoughts and prayers, kind of statements that we all say, but we don't realize that what that does is it kind of makes the person muted. They lose their voice.
Yeah. Boy, you touched on some real themes, societal themes in there about, U.S. culture, about people just wanting you to get over it because they don't want to sit with your distress. There's also sort of, you're talking about the substance abuse, the parent whose child died from substance use, feeling like, well, that person could have made better decisions, and what's wrapped in there. And then I think with the COVID, there's also been that sort of stigma that people, why didn't they protect themselves better, or how did they expose themselves? So, it was a nice intersection, how this already existed in our culture. And this is just one more instance where it gets played out, where people feel invalidated and muted, as you said. So, yeah. Important.
I think I could make like 15 comments to everything you just said in that answer, Jason, because there was so much good information as I'm hearing you talk, and I'm like, oh yeah, and that too, and oh my gosh, yes. And I think the main word that comes to my head as I was listening to you answer that question is compassion. Like how much we just need to have compassion for each other. Like, we're not all going through the same situations, but why not? Why can't that thought process be, I don't understand exactly what you're going through right now, but I can feel for you. I can try to understand you. I can be with you in this moment, And I just posted the other day on social media about crying and the benefits of crying and releasing those tears, and things that we can actually say to people in those moments instead of stop crying. Because I feel like grief and loss is one of those topics that no one knows how to respond. It's just really uncomfortable for everyone. And so as you're making those statements, like, you're just trying to say something positive, because you don't really know what to say, it's very difficult. So with, COVID-19, if someone is experiencing, the loss of a loved one from COVID-19, what are some of the experiences in terms of like preparatory grief with that?
So I think with the preparatory grief, it's so challenging with something like COVID-19, because again, we don't know for sure, even if somebody's in the ICU, the majority of folks are working through it, right? So we don't know for sure if somebody is going to die from it, which makes that whole preparatory piece very challenging. So normally we might walk somebody through like a preparatory death loss as, let's do some life review, let's maybe make a memory book, or do some kind of scrapbooking activity. Let's take a look at, what brought meaning and value and purpose to your life, and how do we share that, and how do we get everyone ready. So with some acute illness like this that we're all trying to avoid, if you become terminally ill, it's hard to do any of the preparatory work. And then oftentimes what happens is you have people feeling bereaved then because they feel robbed and cheated. They didn't have the opportunity for that. And also, it ties into those numbers. So if 10 people go into the ICU and 8 of them live, the other 2 people kind of get that, why me? Why was it my loved one, who had to die, kind of a thing. And, it can be a very spiritual question for many people. And then people, kind of can confuse the spiritual component with a religious component. And then, you get into some different things with that. But our religious or spiritual or cultural beliefs all have different rules for how we prepare for such a thing, right? So that they tell us what we should go through before or after a loss or any type of life transition. But if we have a lack of any type of system like that, it makes it a little more challenging because we're kind of left to define our own preparations. And so if you looked at like New York, for example, for a while there when it was really bad and they had to take people and just pretty much put their bodies in these makeshift morgues that like freezer trucks, if that's your loved one, that creates a whole other set of feeling like I can't be there. I can't be there to help, prepare them for the next part of their life, whatever it is you believe that to be, wherever it is they're going or not going, whatever. And it also creates a delay in the receipt of the death information. When you have a system that's so overwhelmed with deaths happening, they're not really prepared to report that many deaths at once. And so because of that, you're not finding out for a while sometimes if your loved one has died, when normally you would have found out like right away. And it can also create a disturbance in how we grieve because the delayed receipt of that information can make us feel shameful about, oh, well, I was just, having fun over here doing this and here they were dead, that whole time. But with all those other things that are preparatory, it's not just about death, right? Like I was saying. So if I might lose my small business, how do I prepare for that? What's the things I have to put into place if this worst case scenario is going to happen? So there's a lot of anticipation, but I also have to do the work of preparation. And then, I'm an anxious mess pretty much. And then what happens when it comes to fruition is this state of shock, this state of not believing that this could actually happen to me, and that my kind of worst fears of everything I put into this business and now it closed down, coming real.
And at the same time, we're dealing with losses that aren't related to the pandemic. So
Right.
Can you speak to how that might be different, or is it similar? How about those who are experiencing losses that are not directly related to the pandemic at this time?
Sure. Well, I think what we see when we have a pandemic, this thing that's on a global scale, so much focus becomes on that. And then, in a sense, you almost become disenfranchised if you have another form of loss, like we were talking about. Because it's like, my mom's in a nursing home and she died. Oh, did she have COVID? No. Oh, what'd she die of? A heart attack. Oh, okay. It's almost like it's better somehow, to be something different.
Wow.
And it's also kind of like the first one of the first questions out of our mouths when we hear about, any type of loss is, well, what happened? when really our first question should be, how are you? Right?
Mm.
Because they're not necessarily ready to give the details of everything that's happened. And the most important thing now is this person in front of us. But I think, it's difficult when you're dealing with these losses during a pandemic, because somehow society is making it feel like your loss is not as important, and you also can't go out and deal with your loss in the same way that you would. I work with a lot of people, a lot of couples that are going through infertility, because that's a major form of loss that we don't talk too much about. And, unfortunately, a lot of those treatments and things were suspended for a time because they weren't considered like life sustaining. They were elective treatments. And so you have this group of people who've spent a lot of money and a lot of time after years of trying other versions of trying to have a family. And many of them don't have much time to play with. They're already kind of at the point where, they've been trying so long, they're kind of pushing the limits. And now they're being told, well, this isn't life sustaining, which AKA means it's not that important. Not that important for you to get pregnant and to have this family you want. We have to put that on hold. And it's easy for the rest of us to dismiss that and say, well, yeah, we have to take care of the people that are living and lower the limits of risk. But if I'm that person or those people trying to start that family, that's the most important thing to me, and that's something that, I'm now hurting for. And, or even the person that has a child and they've always envisioned, everyone coming to visit them in the nursery at the hospital. And now it's like, yeah, no, only one person can come, and again, they're for our safety, but all these kind of hopes and dreams we had about how things would be it's now different, so there's a lot of different things for the people dealing with loss and life changes that we can't appreciate as much because of everything happening in our society.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that have been coming up a lot with the individuals that I'm working with, and even with myself, is the word loneliness. That the moment we were told, like, you have to stay away from everyone, just like stay in your home, like that loneliness really set in. So if we're in that place of loneliness because of the pandemic, and then we actually lose someone or have those secondary losses or lose someone to death, then that grief component can just kind of add to that sense of loneliness. So how is it different for people to grieve alone as opposed to a community? And if an individual does feel alone, what are some things that they can do to try to connect with the community for that support?
Sure. Yeah. So like I said before, the mourning process, it almost requires other people, it's something that we do to show how we feel about something. We're expressing it. So if we're talking about death loss, we do our mourning through sharing stories of our loved one, about, doing different things like holding candlelight vigils or memorial services, or you see things like people wear mourning clothes. You don't see that as much anymore, but it's a kind of a tradition. You wear all black for a certain amount of time. Well, if you're stuck in your house, who are you wearing the black for?
Mm-hmm.
You kind of just showing off your mourning clothes for your immediate family, I guess. So to not have that mourning, it denies you the opportunity to share the importance of the thing you've lost, right? And so that's the piece that's missing. It's so special to share. If you walk up to a group of people that have just lost something that matters to them and ask each of them to tell you about it, almost undoubtedly they're all going to share stories about the thing that mattered to them, whether it was a person, whether it was a job, a school, a house, whatever. And and they'll tell you about that experience, and there'll be a story associated with that that's filled with emotions. And to not have outlets to do that, or not even have that recognized, is part of the difficulty mourning during this time. I know a school that one of my friends teaches at was actually closing after this year. An elementary school would no longer be open. So all of those students and all those teachers, didn't get to go through the normal end of school process, but this was also the last year for that school. So they kind of ended school on that note, walking out one day not knowing they wouldn't go back, and then next time they do go to school, it's going to be in a completely different building, right? And so that there's a lot of loss associated with that. Some of these teachers have been there 20, 30 years, so those types of things. And you're robbed of your opportunity to mourn, with the other teachers, with the other students, to say goodbye to that school. And that might sound, like it's not very high in comparison to people dealing with death loss, but it's an important part of, of their growing up, and it's an important chapter of their lives. So, again, those are the types of things. But I think the second part of your question was how they can reach out, or
yeah, if someone is feeling alone, how can they connect with the community?
Yeah, I think we're very fortunate, as the technological age that we are, that we have the internet and different modes of connecting and everything. There's a lot of different support available online. There's grief and loss groups for just about anything. There's ones, again, if you've lost a child, if you've lost somebody to suicide, if you lost somebody to any long-term type of illness, you can hop on the website for whatever that illness is and get support. Or even if it's like a military family, they have their own sets of support systems that are in place for them. There's even a thing called like Widows in Stilettos, which is, specifically for women who like to get together and get out after their husbands have died, and feel supported by other women. And so now those people, they're not going to their monthly gatherings anymore, but they can still support one another online or via telephone. And I think it's important too to note that, many of us are now able to go out and do some level of interaction with proper social distancing and PPE. So you can do things like arrange like a social distance memorial service, and the thing is, we don't even have to put that title to it. So almost everything you hear now is, I did a social distance picnic, or I did a social distance whatever. Let's remove the stigma right away. Let's just say we did a picnic. We're applying today's standards to that picnic. So I'm feeling lonely. There's no reason I can't go sit 6 feet away from whoever and just talk and share about my loss and get together in that fashion. And it's also a great time to get a little old school and maybe, write some things down, maybe a journal or an email, and then share it with people, send it to them. And people can really connect that way and share a lot of great memories. It can be as simple as putting the alphabet on a piece of paper and then writing something about the thing you've lost for each letter of the alphabet.
I love that. That's so creative.
Yes, and I think you've kind of answered our next question with some of the innovative ideas that you provided to us. Maybe you just want to just briefly define for us the role of ritual and ceremony. How come we have these rituals and ceremonies in our society?
Yeah, I think they exist because they bring awareness to the things that give us meaning and purpose, and they add value to it. They're definitely markers, and they're chance for that support from our communities, whether it be our family community or small community or the community at large. So if you look back, I mean, all throughout history, we've always kind of done that, you know.
Mhm.
So whether it's a wedding, or whether it's you know, a graduation, or whether it's something we do around somebody being born, you know, though even birthdays, in a sense, if you acknowledge a yearly birthday, you know, you're taking part in a form of ceremony or tradition.
Mhm.
Um, and I think for us, they help us be organized. They help us acknowledge things that matter. Um, and they bring kind of meaning to the moment, and they're supportive. So we know that sometimes rituals and ceremonies are meant to mark a transition, but
Mhm.
other times they can actually be the cause of transition, you know, and be the thing that creates that for us.
Mhm.
So they're not just kind of secondary to what's happening. They're quite important.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so, you know, in that regard, I really personally don't like to see when people say we're not gonna have a funeral, we're just gonna have a picnic because we're just gonna party to remember this person. I think you should have your party, but I think the funeral would also serve a purpose too. You know, it would give us the permission to grieve and to mourn, and to be upset, and to do that in a public way. Um, and again, like we said earlier, don't really want to shy away from our grief. We want to move toward it.
Mhm.
And if we're feeling empowered, then we can definitely move toward it in a better way.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
Vicky, I think you mentioned about tears.
Yeah.
Um, and so one of the things that I like to say is that tears aren't a measure of grief, they're an expression of it, right? So you have some people that will cry a whole lot, and some people who won't cry at all, but we can't really judge how they're doing based.
Yeah. As I hear you speak, I'm having a connection to a past training I was involved in with parents going through divorce. And one of the things that we talk to those parents about is that you need to teach this to your children, because we don't come into the world knowing how to deal with grief and loss. So I don't know if you have anything out there for maybe parents, as you were mentioning earlier, with old adolescents, the losses, but even for that elementary school, those children that were losing their school, and maybe that's their first significant loss in their life. And is there anything that you could share that might be helpful for parents, since we don't come into the world understanding how to
Sure.
grieve loss?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, unfortunately, with kids, they're definitely one of the groups that, you know, we don't talk enough about with it, because I think we feel somehow we're going to damage our children, you know, if we bring up this sad stuff. And you know, and I get it. As parents, our natural drive is to protect them, right? We want them to be happy and healthy and safe. But really, the best thing to do is to be open and honest with them. Now, of course, that has to be at an age appropriate level. They don't need all the details, and they won't even be able to grasp all of the details. But it's really okay to tell them what's happening, and it's okay to show your own emotion in front of them. You know, we fall into that we have to be strong mentality. And because of that, it's kind of like suck it up, or, you know, be a man, or big girls don't cry, or whatever. Um, but the reality is, it's much easier to hold it in and pretend everything is okay than it is to open up to a group of people and be vulnerable, you know, and show that you know, you have fear, or you have emotion, or you can cry, or whatever the case may be. So I think parents being able to share with their children by example, by, you know, sharing their own vulnerabilities and their own fears with their kids, and letting them know it's okay to cry, it's okay to be human, and it's okay to not have all the answers, is just so important. um, I still remember, you know, my 7-year-old, you know, one of the first things he asked me when the pandemic happened was, he was like, well, is anybody gonna die because of this? And I said, well, yeah, buddy, unfortunately, a lot of people will die. And he said, are you gonna die? And I said, well, you know, I really hope not, I said, I'm going to do everything I can not to, but I said, I can't guarantee that. But what I can guarantee you is every day I'm going to live in a way that helps our family, you know, to survive and to be meaningful and to, you know, care about each other. And, you know, he never asked me another question about it. So I think, you know, there's intrigue and, you know, they want to know, and they also need some reassurance. But beyond that, we don't have to explain it all for them. We don't have to be helicopter parents, and we can let them kind of navigate some of this on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And naturally, they're going to kind of find their way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so nicely said, Jason. I really like how you worded that. And I agree that I think just showing our children that we're human is probably one of the best things that we could do. But just figuring out where that limit is of how much we do actually say or share. But that's great. I love that answer. Any other specific resources, not just for children, but just families or anyone who's going through any type of grief or loss that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different things that people should be aware of. So as far as like specific types of research and things regarding grief and what we go through, there's a man named William Worden who has what he calls the four tasks of grieving, which is a very useful resource. It talks about what we have to do in order to kind of move toward our grief and allow it into our life, and try to build a new type of normal for ourselves. And there's another gentleman named Alan Woolfelt, and he has a lot of books about pretty much any type of loss you could have. His books are really user-friendly for people experiencing those losses. So whatever kind of loss you're going through, he's got some type of support out there about it. And then if, you know, I think for anybody dealing with loss, the Hospice Foundation of America's website has links to all types of different support and grief groups out there. I know they even link to things beyond death, like divorce and disability. So those are some of the more common things out there that I think are useful.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And if one of our viewers or listeners would want to reach out to you, would you like to share your contact information?
Sure. Yeah, that's not a problem. So probably the best way to get in touch with me would be my email, which is jason.boyko@lvhn.org.
Wonderful. Is there anything else that you would like to share? Any last thoughts or anything to our viewers?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think if you're watching this, that means that you're taking an interest in how to care for yourself or others dealing with loss or life transitions, and that is enough, because really there's no defining moment that's just going to make it all. You know, I always say you get sex education in school, but you don't get death education. And that's one of the things, you know, we talk about how you come here, but we don't talk about how you leave. So let's start having those conversations.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jason, for being with us today. And thank you, Mark, for being a wonderful co-host. And thank you so much to our viewers and listeners. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any follow-up questions for Jason or any other topics that you would like us to do to support our community about mental health or otherwise. Please reach out. Take it one day at a time. Focus on the positives. Let those emotions out when you need to. And enjoy the beautiful weather. Take care, everyone.